So much for organizing this. It's a great opportunity to meet face-to-face, something that we used to take for granted. I'm going to talk in English because unfortunately I don't speak Spanish, but I will try to keep a slow pace for the brilliant interpreters to be able to translate what I am saying. Is my presentation online here? No? Okay. So I come from Cyprus, from the Mediterranean Institute of Gender Studies, which is based in still sunny Nicosia. We are a small NGO. We work for gender equality and women's rights, and we are affiliated to the University of Nicosia. Our aim is to combat all forms of gender inequalities and to fight for women's rights. And we have understood, we've been around for the last 21 years, and we have understood that education is a great tool towards this aim. I was asked to talk to you about, to give you a gender analysis of educational and career choices, and to talk to you about gender segregation, and to be a little bit practical. So I will draw on two recent research projects that we have been involved in. The one is, it was under the Free to Choose project with the scientific coordination of the University of Valencia here in Spain. And what we have tried to do with Free to Choose was to identify those attitudes and behaviors that perpetuate gender stereotypes and influence gender segregation in education and career choices. So we focused on what people believe and how they make their choices with this project. We had in-depth interviews with young people around Europe. And with the other project, the Gender Ed, we had a research element as well, where we have looked at the structural level of schools, of how gender stereotypes are reinforced, or most importantly, how they are challenged. And I think this is where we should focus our research from now on those practices that challenge gender stereotypes. And I will explain later on. I know that you're very familiar with gender segregation, but just to make sure that we are on the same page, we are fighting gender stereotypes and gender segregation because it limits people's possibilities. We make choices, as you know, many times not based on our real traits and talents, but based on stereotypical ideas about ourselves. So this leads to horizontal segregation, where we have female-dominated sectors or male-dominated sectors, and then we have the vertical segregation with phenomena of glass ceiling and gender inequality. Glass ceiling sometimes, and most of the times, means that women are getting paid less, which has an impact throughout their lives, and that's why we have a huge gender gap, and many women, 65 plus, being poor and living below the poverty line. So, how do we make choices? How do people choose their educational and career paths? What we have identified through our research is that we make choices based on our beliefs about ourselves and our talents, our traits, and our beliefs about the professions. What are the necessary traits in order to be a good professional in the field? Our estimations about our personal talents and about the talents needed for professions are many times stereotypical. When we asked people to identify which are the talents for male-dominated sectors and female-dominated sectors, we have unveiled very well-known gender stereotypes. So, for example, men were considered to be hard work, to have the trait of hard work, to be impatient, to be confident, to have physical strength, and to have practical thinking, just to name a few of the traits. Whereas to women, they were sensitive, they are empaths, they're social, and it was a very dominant idea, this maternal instinct, which leads to specific professions because they are seen as an extension of their maternal role, such as teaching, for example. Women were considered to be multitasking, whereas men were considered to be able to perform one task at a time, which I think is a very well-known common gender stereotype. So, as I said, gender traits lead to different choices. So, for example, the notion that practical thinking is inherited to boys, it can affect their choices. So, and it leads to some specific professions. And I think we also have stereotypes about ourselves as men and women, but we also have a lot of stereotypes about professions and what is needed. And let me give you an example from our research. For example, sensitivity and empathy was one of the main talents that was considered as very necessary for women, of course, psychologists, kindergarten teachers, and teachers in general. But if we think about it, don't male-dominated sectors, such as politicians, need to have empathy and sensitivity? And I think that we have suffered a lot throughout history from politicians who were not empaths and were not sensitive. So I think that we need to question the talents that we believe each profession should have. And there is this very typical example to show this about a famous mathematician, Diana Tamina. She was a Latvian mathematician who entered some decades ago a male-dominated math lab. She was able to solve a problem in geometry using knitting, something that she has learned from a young age. And there is this story of her uncle who said, "Oh, you should stop knitting now because you're a mathematician. And it's not appropriate for an academic mathematician to knit." And she said, "My uncle has no idea about what maths are." Because she managed to solve this problem using algorithms with knitting. And she became very famous. So I think this is what we lose when we do not fully use the talents and the experiences of men and women. And this is only one of the many, many examples in history. Stereotypes are not easy to identify. And because, according to this famous quote, we don't see that we don't see what we don't see. They impact us in many, many ways and in many obvious ways. And I will give you an example through our research where we entered schools being very silent at the back of the class and trying to identify how gender stereotypes work. And there was this teacher who asked the boy to turn on the projector, and he said, "Nicholas, could you turn on the projector because you're the tallest in the class?" And then all of a sudden, 4 girls started laughing, and they said, "Sir, he is the tallest among boys, but there are girls who are taller than him." And I'm only using this example to show how strong stereotypes are in our minds, that they even influence what we see in front of us. Schools convey values and behavioral models which can often reinforce gender stereotypes, although they provide the space to challenge gender stereotypes, and we strongly believe that this is our greatest tool to combat gender stereotypes. But we've seen this boy and girl binary being very obvious in the schools, and we've seen girls and boys from a very young age being pushed to choose different colors, different games, different interests according to their gender. What we have also seen is that students learn very clearly at school from a very young age, which is the gender which is more valuable and more important in history, in sports, in politics, in science, in arts, in poetry. And when you increase the opportunities of the one gender, at the same time, you decrease the opportunities of the other gender. And that's why we learn that women have supplementary roles in history, and we learn this in school. And it's very surprising to me why we don't challenge this, because I don't remember anyone in my class, and I haven't observed anyone in schools asking, where were the women, or where are the women in history, for example. Gender power relations are obvious not only in the curricula, as I have just explained, but they are obvious in the geography of the schools as well. And maybe it's the reality here as well, but we have a dominant soccer field, which is male-dominated, and I have experienced incidences where boys keep their space using even sexual harassment. And it's very interesting to observe that it's exactly the same mechanism that politicians use to safeguard their space in parliament as well. It's the same mechanisms. We've seen incidences of sexual harassment when women were becoming more loud than they should in the parliament and in schools. So I think it's worth examining the mechanisms, because I think that if we want to combat gender stereotypes, we need to know very, very well how they are manifested and the power relationships behind them. And our research was very positive, and I would like to see the glass half full, because we've seen incidences of teachers challenging gender stereotypes in schools. For example, a discussion in Italy about French Revolution, which was in the curricula, but a critical eye talking to students about how human rights were men's rights. And in Cyprus, where there was not an absence of gender issues in the curricula, in the class of Greek language, where the student used this opportunity when they were discussing about freedom to talk about women's rights under this umbrella. We have seen students challenging gender stereotypes. For example, when a teacher taught them that women should perform easier exercises, we've seen a reaction from the boys. So it's always a negotiation of power structures and gender stereotypes. And I think we should shed light into these moments, and we should use what is already there. We have developed, and I'm sure that many of you are colleagues, and you have developed brilliant projects to combat gender stereotypes. What we have understood working to combat gender stereotypes is that we need non-formal education. We need games, we need apps, we need something interesting, and we need to get out of this structured knowledge and this teaching as we know it. So we have understood that children love talking about themselves and their gender, and I had this very positive experience when I went to a school, and I was asked to present our projects, and then a student told me, when I was in my previous school, we have implemented a project of yours with our teacher, because we always work with the teachers, because they are multipliers, they have already the relationship, and that girl told me, thank you so much for providing a tool that is interesting to us and that takes us into account. And when she said that, I felt very responsible, that we should also try to advocate and to provide tools that are useful and that students think that they take them into account, unlike a typical educational system does. So, to conclude, because I only have 1 minute and I take time very seriously. I think that what we need, and maybe it's a great space to discuss among us, we need we know that we have great value on projects and interventions of non-formal education, and maybe we will have the opportunity to discuss further later on. But I really do believe that we should always and always be political and advocate for an organizational transformation. And the effect, because I believe that the effect of any intervention will be continuously undermined by the normalized gender inequality perpetuating process in education and in society. So I invite you, as we will have the opportunity to discuss later on, to imagine a project that will also have this political aspect of advocating for social and structural change within and through education. Thank you so much.